Once upon a time, in a small town where the sun always seemed to shine too brightly, there lived a woman named Margaret. She was the kind of rich that made people whisper when she walked by. Her clothes were shiny like a new coin, her jewelry sparkled like stars, and her house stood taller than any other. Margaret had everything: money, fame, and a husband as handsome as a carved statue. However, there's one more thing that made Margaret well known throughout the town: her dog, Kido. You see, Margaret's heart was as cold as the Harmattan wind. Her face was tight, like someone had stolen her smile. She didn't need to shout to make people tremble. Her dog, Kido, did that for her. Kido was a big black dog with eyes sharp as daggers and claws like spears. He obeyed Margaret's every word, ready to attack anyone she pointed at. In her house, silence was louder than thunder. The maids walked on eggshells, their hands shaking as they worked. Margaret's laugh, when it came, was like a snake's hiss. It sent chills down spines. Her husband, Amici, was hardly ever home. He traveled from town to town for work, leaving Margaret alone in her big house. But even with all her riches, there was one thing Margaret didn't have. Her belly had never swelled with pregnancy. She had no child to call her own, and this gnawed at her like a rat chewing through a sack of grain. Every night, Margaret sat in her room, staring out the window. The moonlight touched her face, but it didn't soften her heart. She clenched her fists and muttered, "What good is all this wealth if I can't have a child?" And so, the days went by, and the woman with everything still felt like she had nothing. One evening, Amechi returned home from one of his long trips. The house was as quiet as a graveyard, with only the distant growl of Kido breaking the silence. Amechi sat with Margaret in the grand sitting room, where the chairs were as shiny as mirrors. He looked at his wife, her face tight as always, and said softly, "Margaret, we need a child in this house." Margaret's eyes narrowed like a hawk spotting prey. "A child," she scoffed. "What do I need a child for?" "Margaret," Amechi said patiently, "you're lonely, and I'm always traveling. A child will bring joy to this home." Margaret snorted. "Joy? A child will bring nothing but noise and trouble." But Amechi didn't give up. Day after day, he talked to her, persuading her like a farmer coaxing stubborn goats into a pen. Finally, Margaret sighed heavily and said, "Fine, let's go. But don't expect me to play mother." The next morning, they drove to the orphanage. Margaret stood stiffly by the door, while Amici walked around, looking at the children. Then his eyes fell on a small girl sitting quietly in a corner. Her name was Amarachi. She was as gentle as a breeze, with eyes big and curious like a baby deer. "This one," Amechi said, smiling. "She's perfect." Margaret barely glanced at the girl. "If you like her, take her," she said coldly. On the way home, Amechi tried to lighten the mood. He looked at Amarachi, then at Margaret, and chuckled. "Amarachi looks like you, Margaret," he said playfully. Margaret's head snapped toward him, her face hard as stone. "Don't be ridiculous," she spat. "Even if I had a child, she wouldn't look so wretched." The car fell silent. Amarachi, sitting quietly, looked out the window at the tall trees and colorful houses. Her little heart fluttered with excitement and fear. She thought about her new home and the chance to have a family. But Margaret's cold words lingered like a shadow over her joy. When they reached the house, Amarachi stepped out of the car and stared in awe at the grand building before her. The house was bigger than she had ever imagined, with tall windows that gleamed like eyes. But something about it felt strange, as if the walls were whispering secrets she couldn't hear. couldn't. From the first day, Margaret showed Amarachi who ruled the house. Her voice was sharp like the crack of a whip, and her words struck like arrows. "Listen to me, little girl," Margaret said, towering over Amarachi. "You will not touch anything in this house unless I tell you to, especially that bag," she said, pointing at an old handbag kept beside her wardrobe. "You will not enter any room unless I say so. If you disobey me, you'll regret ever stepping into my home. Do you understand?" "Yes, Ma," Amarachi whispered, her eyes fixed on the ground. She wondered why Margaret emphasized more on the bag. Little did she know, it held a secret that not even Amechi, Margaret's husband, knows of. The house was grand, with shiny floors that reflected the light like a still river. But for Amarachi, it felt like a cold, empty cage. She tiptoed through the hallways, afraid her footsteps might be too loud. The workers too avoided her, their eyes darting away whenever Margaret was near. Amarachi spent her days in silence, sitting in her room with her little bag of belongings. She tried her best to stay out of Margaret's way, but the walls of the house seemed to close in on her, whispering their own cruel secrets. One quiet night, after a lonely meal, Amarachi sat on her bed and opened her bag. Inside, she found a small crumpled photograph of her father. His face was kind, his smile warm like the morning sun. She held the picture close to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks like tiny streams. "Papa," she whispered, her voice breaking, "why did you leave me? Why is she so mean to me?" The moonlight spilled into the room, painting her small figure in silver. She clutched the photo tightly, wondering if things would ever get better. The next morning, Amechi packed his bags for another trip. He knelt in front of Amarachi, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Amarachi," he said softly, "be a good girl while I'm away. Listen to your mother and don't make any trouble." "Yes, sir," Amarachi replied, forcing a small smile. Amechi kissed her forehead and stood to leave. As the car pulled out of the driveway, Amarachi watched him go, her heart sinking. The house felt colder without him, and she was left alone with Margaret. Margaret's eyes were sharp as she turned to Amarachi. "Remember what I told you," she said, her voice colder than the morning dew. "Yes, Ma," Amarachi whispered again, shrinking into herself. The days ahead stretched like a long, lonely road, and Amarachi braced herself for what was to come. Days passed, and Amarachi tried her best to stay unnoticed in the house. But one afternoon, as she sat quietly in her room, her eyes fell on an old dusty bag tucked in the corner. It looked out of place, sitting there as if it was hiding a secret. Her heart raced. Curiosity buzzed in her like a trapped bee. What could be inside? Why did Madame Margaret warn me against going near it? She whispered to herself. At first, she tried to ignore it, but the bag seemed to call her name, daring her to come closer. Slowly, Amarachi crept toward it. She glanced at the door to make sure no one was watching. Her hands trembled as she unzipped the bag. What she saw made her freeze in terror. The bag was filled with bloody rags, strange bones, and odd charms. There were small bottles filled with dark liquids, and the smell was foul, like rotting meat. Her stomach turned, and she let out a scream that echoed through the house. Within moments, Margaret stormed into the room, her face twisted with fury. "What are you doing?" she roared. Amarachi stumbled backward, shaking with fear. I didn't mean to, Ma," she stammered. "I was just curious." Margaret's eyes burned like hot coals. "Curiosity?" she hissed. "You dare to touch what's not yours?" Without another word, Margaret grabbed Amarachi by the arm and dragged her out of the room. Her grip was like iron, and Amarachi cried out in pain. "Kiddo!" Margaret called, her voice sharp as a knife. The dog appeared instantly, its dark eyes gleaming with excitement. Margaret pointed at Amarachi. "Chase her," she commanded. Amarachi's heart dropped. She bolted, her legs moving as fast as they could. But Kiddo was faster. The dog snarled and leapt at her, its claws tearing through her skin. Amarachi screamed in agony as she fell to the ground, her small body unable to fight back. The world around her blurred as pain consumed her. Blood soaked her clothes, and she could barely move. At that moment, the sound of a car engine roared in the distance. Amechi was back. When he stepped out of the car, the sight before him made his blood run cold. Amarachi lay in a pool of blood, her small frame trembling as Kiddo stood over her. "Amarachi!" he shouted, rushing to her. Margaret stood frozen, her face pale. Amechi scooped Amarachi into his arms and carried her to the car, his voice shaking as he barked orders to the driver. "Take us to the hospital. Now!" Margaret followed behind, her heart pounding. For the first time, she felt the weight of what she had done, but her lies were ready, sitting on the edge of her tongue like poison waiting to spill. The car screeched into the hospital parking lot as Amechi jumped out, holding Amarachi close to his chest. Her tiny body was limp, her clothes soaked in blood, and her breath came in soft, shallow gasps. "Help! Somebody help!" Amechi shouted, his voice cracking like dry wood in the wind. Doctors and nurses rushed out, wheeling a stretcher toward him. They carefully laid Amarachi down, her fragile frame looking even smaller under the bright hospital lights. Amechi followed closely, his face drenched in sweat, his heart pounding like a drum. Margaret entered moments later, her face pale, her hands clutching her purse tightly. When Amechi turned to her, his eyes were fierce. "What happened?" he demanded. Margaret forced a shaky smile, her voice trembling. "Kiddo and Amarachi were playing," she said quickly. "I was dressing up when I heard the noise. By the time I came out, this had already happened." Amechi's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press further. The urgency of Amarachi's condition outweighed everything else. Inside the emergency room, the doctor examined Amarachi. His face grew serious as he turned to Amechi. "She's lost a lot of blood," he said. "She'll need a transfusion immediately." "Take my blood," Amechi said without hesitation. The doctor nodded and quickly ordered a test. Minutes later, he returned, shaking his head. "Your blood doesn't match hers." Amechi's heart sank. "What do we do now?" he asked, desperation in his voice. "We'll test the mother's blood," the doctor said, glancing at Margaret. Margaret's hands trembled as she reluctantly held out her arm. The nurse drew her blood and hurried off. The room felt heavy with silence as they waited. Amechi paced back and forth, his eyes darting to the unconscious Amarachi. Finally, the doctor returned, holding the test results. "It's a perfect match," he said. "Her mother's blood matches exactly." Margaret froze, her face drained of color. Amechi's head snapped toward her, confusion and disbelief flashing in his eyes. The doctor looked between them. "Isn't she your biological child?" he asked, his tone careful but curious. "No," Margaret started to say, but her voice caught in her throat. Amechi stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "Margaret, what's going on?" Margaret couldn't speak. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, and for the first time in years, she felt trapped with no way out. The truth was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was clawing its way to the surface, ready to tear apart everything she had built. The hospital room was thick with tension as the doctor's words hung in the air. Margaret, the test confirmed it. You are Amarachi's biological mother. Amechi's face twisted in confusion. Margaret, he said, his voice trembling. What is he talking about? How can Amarachi be your child? Margaret stood frozen, her lips quivering, her heart pounding like thunder in her chest. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Then, as if a dam had broken, tears spilled from her eyes, and she fell to her knees. Amechi, she whispered, her voice barely audible. There's something I need to tell you. Amechi knelt beside her, his face a mix of worry and anger. Tell me, Margaret, what's going on? Through her sobs, Margaret began to speak. 10 years ago, I had a baby, she said, her voice cracking like brittle glass. Her name was Amelia. Amechi's eyes widened. You had a child? You never told me. Margaret nodded, the weight of her secrets pressing down on her shoulders. It was before I met you. My husband and I lived a simple life. But then everything went wrong. She took a deep breath and continued. One day, a fire destroyed everything we owned, our house, our belongings, even his small shop. We had nothing left, Amechi. Nothing. My husband tried his best, but he couldn't feed us. He couldn't even buy milk for Amelia. I couldn't live like that anymore. Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. I left, she admitted, her words spilling out like a confession. I left my husband. I left Amelia. I couldn't bear the hunger, the shame. I told myself I'd come back for her one day, but I never did. Amechi stared at her, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. You abandoned your own child? He said, his voice sharp. You left her to suffer? Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know what else to do, she whispered. I thought she'd have a better chance without me. Amechi stood and turned away, his back stiff. And now, that same child is in our home, suffering under your hand. Do you even realize what you've done, Margaret? Margaret looked up at him, her face wet with tears. I didn't know, Amechi. I didn't know she was my Amelia. I didn't recognize her. Amechi's voice was cold as he said, the matron at the orphanage told me her name was Amelia. She even said she'd lost her father when she was 5. How did you not piece it together? Margaret's breath caught, her guilt suffocating her like a heavy blanket. She couldn't find the words to answer. The truth was out now, and it sat between them like a sharp blade. Amechi's disappointment was clear, etched into his face like a scar. He turned to the doctor. Will she survive? He asked, his voice soft but steady. The doctor nodded. With the transfusion and rest, she will recover. Amechi sighed, his shoulders slumping. That's all that matters for now. Margaret sat silently on the cold floor, the weight of her past crushing her. The child she had abandoned, the child she had hurt, was right in front of her, and she could no longer run from the truth. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of machines. Amarachi's small frame lay still, wrapped in bandages, but her fingers clutched something tightly. As she stirred awake, her weak hands trembled, holding on to a blood-stained picture. Amechi leaned closer. Amarachi, what's that in your hand? He asked gently. Amarachi's grip tightened, and her lips moved faintly. Papa, she whispered, her voice barely audible. After some coaxing, Amechi carefully took the picture from her hands. When he looked at it, his breath caught. It was a wedding photo of Margaret and a man he didn't recognize. A man who could only be her late husband. The pieces began to fall into place, but Amechi said nothing, his heart heavy. Margaret's eyes landed on the photo, and a gasp escaped her lips. The memories she had buried deep came rushing back like a flood. The man, the fire, the poverty, and the baby she had abandoned, all of it hit her like a blow. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, That's my wedding picture." Amechi's expression hardened, his silence louder than words. He cradled Amarachi in his arms and vowed to protect her. When the doctors cleared Amarachi to leave, Amechi took her home, keeping a watchful eye on Margaret. As they arrived at the house, something felt different. The workers greeted them with downcast eyes and hurried movements. The fear was palpable, and Amechi noticed it immediately. Why do they look so scared, he thought, his instincts sharpening. He didn't ask yet, but the unease settled deep in his chest. Back at the house, Amechi carried Amarachi to her room and laid her down gently. The silence in the house was heavy, like the calm before a storm. But as he walked through the halls, a strange smell caught his attention. He followed the scent to a room he had never entered before. When he opened the door, his blood ran cold. The sight before him was like something out of a nightmare. Severed hands, bloody clothes, and strange objects were scattered across the floor. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and dark stains covered the walls. The workers, who had been silently enduring, saw Amechi's discovery and fled in terror, their screams echoing through the house. Amechi stood frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend the horror before him. He stormed into the sitting room where Margaret sat, her face pale. "Margaret!" he roared. "What is this?" Margaret trembled, her voice shaking as she began to speak. I couldn't control it," she stammered. "When someone disobeyed me, I punished them. She paused, her voice breaking. "I cut their hands. I fed them to Kido." Amechi's eyes widened in disbelief. You tortured them? You fed them to the dog?" Margaret broke down, her sobs filling the room. "I was angry. I was bitter. My past, it haunted me, and I took it out on them." Amechi's disgust grew with every word. He picked up his phone and called the police. "Come immediately," he said, his voice firm. "There's a monster in my house." When the police arrived, they arrested Margaret and took Kido away. The once proud woman, who had ruled her home with fear, was now a shadow of herself. Amechi, disgusted and heartbroken, sold the house the very next day. He vowed to start anew, building a safe and loving home for Amarachi, free from the darkness that had haunted their lives. The house that once stood as a symbol of Margaret's power and wealth was sold, its walls left to hold only memories of pain and terror. Amechi, determined to leave the past behind, built a new life for himself and Amarachi in another town. In this new home, light filled every corner and laughter replaced silence. Amechi soon married a kind and gentle woman named Ugochi. Her heart was warm like the morning sun, and she treated Amarachi as her own daughter. Not long after, Ugochi gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, bringing more joy to their growing family. Amarachi, fully recovered from her ordeal, blossomed in this loving environment. She found comfort in the arms of her new family, who cherished her for who she was. The scars of her past began to fade as she grew stronger and more confident. As the years passed, Amarachi decided to leave the town to chase her dreams and build a life of her own. With love and blessings, from Amechi and Ugochi, she moved to the city, determined to leave behind the shadows of her childhood. Margaret, once the wealthiest woman in the town, returned after serving her time in prison. But she was no longer the proud, commanding figure she once was. Her body was frail, her face hollow, and her eyes carried the weight of her sins. Walking the streets she once ruled, she begged for alms, her hands trembling as she stretched them out to strangers. The townsfolk whispered when they saw her, their words cutting like blades. "That's Margaret," they said, "the woman who let her greed and cruelty destroy everything." Her heart ached with every step, haunted by the memories of what she had done to her maids, her husband, and most of all, her daughter. She longed to see Amarachi, to beg for forgiveness and hold her once more. But when she asked around, she learned that Amarachi had left the town long ago, determined to leave her painful past behind. Margaret's shoulders sagged under the weight of regret. She realized that she had lost everything: her family, her wealth, and her dignity. And now, the one person she wanted to see the most was gone. Sitting by the roadside, with only the clothes on her back and a cup for alms, Margaret accepted her fate. Her once glittering life had turned to dust, and the joy she had sought so desperately was lost forever. In the quiet of her days, she whispered to herself, "I had everything, and I ruined it all." And so, Margaret lived the rest of her life in sorrow, carrying the heavy burden of her actions, knowing she had destroyed the one chance at true happiness she ever had. I hope you enjoyed the story. If so, please like the video, comment what you learned from the tale, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more enchanting tales just like this one. Thank you.